Close your eyes and feel the gentle rhythm of needles clicking together, creating fabric loop by loop. Tonight, we're following the ancient path of knitting as it winds through civilizations and across continents, from its mysterious origins in the Middle East to living rooms around the world today. Let the steady, meditative motion of yarn and needles carry you into peaceful sleep as we explore this craft that has warmed, clothed, and comforted humanity for over 1,000 years. The history of knitting reaches back further into antiquity than crochet, though even knitting's origins are somewhat mysterious and debated. Unlike weaving, which has clear archaeological evidence dating back tens of thousands of years, knitting appears much later in the human story, but definitively earlier than crochet. The earliest known examples of true knitting date from the Islamic world in the first millennium CE, though the technique may have existed even earlier, with evidence simply not surviving. What we can say with confidence is that by around 1000 CE, sophisticated knitting was being practiced in Egypt and the Middle East, producing complex, colorful patterns that demonstrate the technique was already well developed by that time. The oldest known knitted artifacts are socks and fragments found in Egypt, dating from around the 11th century CE. These early pieces show remarkable sophistication, featuring complex color patterns and fine gauge work, suggesting that knitting had already been practiced and refined for some time before these pieces were made. The technique used in these early examples was likely knitting with a single needle, more like nail binding, an earlier related technique, or possibly knitting as we know it today with 2 or more needles. Nail binding is often confused with knitting. It creates similar-looking fabric, but uses a single blunt needle and short lengths of yarn, working somewhat like sewing. Nail binding is definitely ancient, with examples found in Denmark dating back to around 6500 BCE, but it's a distinct technique from true knitting. True knitting, which uses long, continuous strands of yarn and creates interlocking loops using pointed needles, appears to have developed in the Middle East, possibly evolving from earlier techniques or possibly invented independently. The word knit comes from the Old English knitten, meaning to tie with a knot, which gives us a clue about how people understood the technique as a way of creating knotted fabric. In Arabic, the craft was called nail binding at first, but true knitting became hik or similar terms depending on the region. The earliest knitting seems to have been done in the round, creating seamless tubes perfect for socks, leggings, and caps. This makes sense practically. Circular knitting is in some ways more intuitive than flat knitting, and the resulting seamless garments are more comfortable to wear. Early Islamic knitters created incredibly sophisticated work, including knitted silk cushion covers, pouches, and other items for wealthy patrons. Some of these pieces feature Arabic calligraphy knitted in contrasting colors, requiring great skill to execute. The geometric patterns and intricate color work in these early pieces demonstrate that knitting was already being practiced at a high artistic level. Islamic knitters worked with fine silk and cotton threads, creating fabrics that were both beautiful and functional. From the Middle East, knitting spread along trade routes. By the 13th and 14th centuries, knitting had reached Europe, probably arriving via Spain, which was under Islamic rule in parts, and served as a cultural bridge between the Islamic world and Christian Europe. Italian merchants and traders, who had extensive contact with the Middle East through commerce, also likely brought knitting knowledge back to Europe. The earliest evidence of knitting in Europe appears in Spain, with beautifully knitted silk gloves and stockings that show clear Middle Eastern influence in their patterns and techniques. These early European knitted items were luxury goods, owned only by the wealthy, as the fine silk or wool yarn and the skilled labor required made them expensive. By the late Middle Ages, knitting had become established in Europe, and guilds of knitters formed in major cities. These guilds were powerful organizations that controlled who could knit professionally, set quality standards, and protected their members' economic interests. Becoming a master knitter in a guild required years of training and the completion of a masterpiece, an extraordinarily complex knitted item that demonstrated complete mastery of the craft. One such masterpiece requirement, still preserved from the Knitting Guild of Strasbourg, required the candidate to create a felted cap, a pair of gloves, a shirt or waistcoat with a collar, and a carpet, all knitted in multiple colors and complex patterns, all within a 13-week period. These requirements were intentionally difficult, ensuring that only truly skilled knitters could become masters. Interestingly, these early knitting guilds were predominantly male. In medieval Europe, professional crafts organized into guilds were typically men's work, while women did knitting at home for their families. This gender division would later reverse, with knitting becoming predominantly associated with women. But in its early centuries in Europe, professional knitting was a male-dominated trade. Master knitters were respected craftsmen who earned good livings, creating fine stockings, caps, and other garments for wealthy clients. The invention of knitted stockings was revolutionary for European fashion and comfort. Before knitted stockings, people wore woven cloth leg coverings that didn't fit well and provided less warmth. Knitted stockings, being elastic and form-fitting, were far superior, and they quickly became highly desirable. In the 16th century, Queen Elizabeth I of England received her first pair of knitted silk stockings as a gift and reportedly declared she would never wear cloth hose again. The wealthy commissioned custom stockings in silk, often elaborately decorated with patterns, while common people wore simpler wool stockings. The demand for knitted stockings drove much of the European knitting industry for centuries. Knitting patterns began to develop regional characteristics as the craft spread across Europe. Different areas developed distinctive styles based on local wool types, climate needs, traditional designs, and available dyes. In the cold northern regions, thick, warm knitting traditions developed, while in warmer southern areas, finer, lighter knitting was preferred. Colorwork knitting, featuring intricate patterns in multiple colors, became particularly developed in areas with strong traditions of textile decoration and access to good dyes. During the 16th century, knitting became more widespread among common people in Europe. As the techniques became more widely known beyond the guilds, more people, particularly women, took up knitting. Farm wives knitted stockings, caps, and other items for their families during winter months when outdoor work was impossible. Knitting was portable, required minimal equipment, and could be done by firelight or candlelight, making it ideal for long winter evenings. Children learned to knit young, often by age 5 or 6, and would knit while tending sheep or doing other tasks that left their hands relatively free. In many poor families, children's knitting contributed to family income, with young children producing simple items, while older, more skilled members created more complex pieces to sell. The economic importance of hand knitting in pre-industrial Europe cannot be overstated. For many poor families, knitting provided crucial supplementary income or even primary income. Women would knit constantly, while walking to market, while watching children, while visiting with neighbors, their needles almost never still. The ability to knit quickly and well could mean the difference between poverty and modest security. This economic pressure led to the development of knitting sheaths, or knitting sticks, tools worn at the waist that held one needle steady, allowing faster, more efficient knitting. These tools were particularly popular in England and Northern Europe, and antique knitting sticks are now collectible artifacts. Some were elaborately carved by sweethearts as courting gifts, combining the practical with the romantic. The 16th and 17th centuries saw the development of many traditional knitting patterns still known today. Fair Isle knitting, named after one of the Scottish Shetland Islands, features intricate patterns in multiple colors, traditionally only 2 colors per row, creating geometric or floral designs. The exact origins of Fair Isle patterns are debated. Some historians believe they were influenced by Spanish sailors from shipwrecked Armada ships in 1588, while others argue they developed independently from older Nordic knitting traditions. Regardless of origin, Fair Isle knitting became a distinctive and beloved style, with traditional patterns passed down through generations. Aran knitting, from the Aran Islands off the west coast of Ireland, developed its own distinctive character, featuring complex cable and texture patterns on cream-colored wool. The romantic story often told is that each family had its own unique pattern, so that drowned fishermen could be identified by their sweaters. But this is largely a 20th century invention. The reality is that Aran knitting, as we know it, probably developed in the late 19th or early 20th century. Those simpler knitting traditions on the islands go back much further. Regardless of the myths, Aran knitting is beautiful and technically challenging, featuring ropes, cables, diamonds, and other textured patterns that create thick, warm, sculptural fabric. These cables are created by crossing stitches over each other, requiring a cable needle or other tool and considerable skill to execute properly. Estonian lace knitting developed intricate, delicate patterns, featuring elaborate lace and texture work, often knitted in gossamer fine yarn on tiny needles. Estonian knitters created shawls so fine they could be pulled through a wedding ring, demonstrating incredible skill. These shawls were often white or natural colored, featuring points or scalloped edges, and patterns inspired by nature: leaves, flowers, ferns, and snowflakes. Icelandic knitting traditions developed around the lopi sweater, featuring circular yokes with distinctive color patterns, usually in natural sheep colors: white, gray, brown, and black. These sweaters are knitted seamlessly in the round, from the bottom up, with the colorwork concentrated in the yoke. The thick, warm Icelandic wool, which comes from a special breed of sheep brought to Iceland by the Vikings, is perfect for the harsh climate. Norwegian knitting traditions feature their own distinctive patterns, particularly the Selbu patterns, named after the Norwegian village where they originated. The Selbu rose, a star-like 8-petaled flower, appears on mittens, hats, and sweaters, usually knitted in black and white or other contrasting colors. Norwegian knitters also created lusekofte, sweaters with all-over small geometric patterns in contrasting colors, traditionally worn as outerwear by fishermen and farmers. Swedish knitting developed the tradition of twinsstickning, or twined knitting, a technique that creates an incredibly dense, warm, and durable fabric by using 2 strands of yarn alternately. This technique was used for mittens, socks, and other items that needed to withstand hard use in cold climates. The resulting fabric is reversible and remarkably strong. During the 17th century, knitting faced its first major technological challenge: the invention of the knitting machine. In 1589, English clergyman William Lee invented the first knitting frame, a machine that could knit stockings much faster than hand knitters. Lee sought a patent from Queen Elizabeth I, but she allegedly refused, concerned about putting hand knitters out of work. Whether this story is precisely accurate or not, Lee's machine was indeed revolutionary, though it took decades to refine and become widely adopted. The early knitting machines could only produce relatively simple stockings, not the complex patterns and textures that skilled hand knitters created. Over the following centuries, knitting machines improved and became more common, particularly for producing plain stockings and other basic knitted goods. This industrialization significantly impacted hand knitters who relied on knitting for income. The price of machine-knit stockings dropped dramatically, undercutting hand knitters and forcing many out of the trade. However, hand knitting never disappeared. It persisted for items that machines couldn't produce, and gradually transformed from primarily economic activity to a combination of practical necessity and creative craft. The 18th century saw knitting thoroughly integrated into daily life across Europe and in European colonies in North America and elsewhere. Women knitted constantly, creating all the stockings, mittens, caps, and other knitted items their families needed. Wealthy women knitted silk and fine cotton items as accomplishments, demonstrating their refinement and patience, while poor women knitted coarse wool from necessity, creating warmth and sometimes income. Knitting was considered appropriate work for women of all classes because it was quiet, could be done while supervising children or visiting, and produced useful results. During the American colonial period, knitting was an essential skill for survival. With manufactured goods expensive and hard to obtain, particularly in rural areas, families depended on home production of textiles. Colonial women spun their own yarn from wool or flax and knitted stockings, mittens, and other items for their families. Children learned to knit young, and knitting was sometimes taught in schools as a basic life skill. The ability to produce warm clothing through knitting could literally mean survival during harsh winters. Colonial knitters developed their own traditions, sometimes adapting European patterns to available materials and local conditions, creating distinctively American styles. The American Revolution brought knitting into the political sphere. During the colonial boycott of British goods, American women knitted and wove to produce textiles locally rather than importing them from Britain. This homespun movement was both practical and political, with wearing homespun cloth becoming a patriotic statement. Women gathered for knitting circles that were also political meetings, discussing independence while working with their needles. During the Revolutionary War, women knitted stockings, blankets, and other items for Continental Army soldiers, their needles serving the cause of independence. The 19th century brought dramatic changes to knitting, with the Industrial Revolution's full impact. Knitting machines improved significantly, and factories appeared producing knitted goods on a large scale. Machine-knit stockings, underwear, and other basic items became cheap and widely available, which was beneficial for consumers, but devastating for hand knitters who had relied on selling their work. In response, hand knitting increasingly focused on items that machines couldn't easily produce: complex patterns, custom sizes, fine lacework, and decorative items. Hand knitting also became more clearly divided between economic necessity in poor or rural areas where people still needed to produce their own clothing, and leisure activity for middle-class and wealthy women who knitted for pleasure and accomplishment rather than survival. The Victorian era saw knitting firmly established as a feminine accomplishment and leisure activity. Middle-class Victorian women were expected to be skilled in various needlecrafts, including knitting. They knitted lace shawls, decorative afghans, and fancy stockings for themselves and as gifts. Pattern books proliferated, offering increasingly elaborate designs. Victorian knitters experimented with unusual materials like silk ribbon, chenille, and metallic threads, creating decorative items that showcased technical skill. A Victorian aesthetic valued elaborate decoration, and knitting adapted, with complex lace patterns, intricate color work, and embellishments like beading being incorporated into knitted items. However, for working-class and rural women, knitting remained practical rather than decorative, producing warm, sturdy items for family use. The 19th century also saw the development of knitting as a form of therapy and moral instruction. In Victorian Britain, workhouses taught knitting to poor women and children as both a skill and a form of moral discipline. Asylums used knitting as occupational therapy, believing the repetitive motion calmed disturbed minds. Hospitals taught wounded soldiers to knit during recovery, finding it helped both mentally and physically. This medicinal view of knitting would be echoed in modern understanding of knitting's therapeutic benefits. The American Civil War brought another surge in wartime knitting. Northern and Southern women alike knitted for soldiers, socks, scarves, caps, and gloves by the thousands. Knitting circles met to work together, and women knit while discussing the war's progress, mourning the dead, and supporting each other through the conflict's hardships. Knitted items from home were tangible connections to loved ones for soldiers far from home, and many treasured these handmade gifts. After the Civil War, Victorian America embraced fancy knitting as enthusiastically as Britain. American women knitted elaborate shawls, afghans, and decorative items, following European patterns and developing their own variations. American knitting patterns often featured patriotic themes, eagles, stars, and other national symbols, particularly in quilts and afghans. The late 19th century saw the publication of numerous knitting books and magazines featuring patterns, with publications like Godey's Lady's Book, including knitting patterns alongside fashion plates and stories. World War I mobilized knitters on an unprecedented scale. When war broke out in 1914, governments in Britain, America, France, and other allied nations organized massive knitting campaigns to produce socks, scarves, helmets liners, and other items for soldiers. The Red Cross coordinated much of this effort, distributing patterns and specifications for military knitting. Women, children, and even some men knitted for the war effort, producing millions of items. Knitting became a patriotic duty, and women knit in public spaces, in parks, at rallies, even in theaters before movies, demonstrating their support for the troops. School children knit squares that were assembled into blankets, and knitting competitions were held to see who could knit the fastest or produce the most items. The sheer scale of WW1 knitting was staggering, with estimates suggesting that American knitters alone produced over 1 million knitted items every month at the war's peak. These items weren't luxuries, but necessities. Trench warfare in cold, wet conditions meant soldiers desperately needed warm, dry socks and other knitted goods to prevent trench foot and other cold-related injuries. The military specifications for these items were exacting, with required measurements and construction methods to ensure they met military needs. Hand-knit socks, in particular, were superior to mass-produced ones for soldiers' needs. They could be made to custom sizes. The hand-knit fabric was softer and more comfortable, and any lumps or poor seaming that might cause blisters could be corrected. Between the world wars, knitting remained popular both as practical skill and leisure activity. The 1920s and 30s saw knitting adapt to changing fashions. Knitted swimwear became popular, impractical by modern standards, as wool gets heavy when wet and loses its shape, but stylish at the time. Knitted dresses, cardigans, and other fashionable items appeared in style magazines. The development of new yarns expanded knitting's possibilities. Cotton yarns for summer knitting, rayon and other early synthetic fibers for varied textures and sheens. The Great Depression brought renewed practical focus to knitting. With money scarce, people knitted to create warm clothing they couldn't afford to buy. Patterns emphasized economy, showing how to make garments with minimal yarn or how to recycle yarn from worn-out items by unraveling them and reusing the fiber. Make, do, and mend became essential, and knitting skills that might have been seen as old-fashioned suddenly became valuable survival techniques. Free or very cheap patterns were distributed to help people create warm clothing during hard times. World War II again mobilized knitters for war production, even more extensively than in World War I. The pattern was similar. Governments and organizations like the Red Cross distributed patterns and coordinated knitting efforts. Knitters produced millions of items for soldiers, and knitting became a visible symbol of home front support. However, World War II knitting was complicated by yarn rationing. Wool was needed for military uniforms and equipment, so civilian knitters had to make do with limited supplies. Patterns emphasized yarn economy, and knitters saved and reused every scrap. Some patterns specifically addressed how to modify designs to use less yarn, or how to combine different yarns when you couldn't get enough of one type. Despite rationing, or perhaps because of it, World War II knitting was enormously productive. Women in Britain, America, Canada, Australia, and other allied nations knitted constantly. Actress Betty Grable appeared in photos knitting, encouraging others to do likewise. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt was photographed knitting, as was British Queen Elizabeth. Knitting was portrayed as feminine patriotism, a way women could directly support the war effort. The post-war period saw knitting flourish as prosperity returned. The late 1940s and 1950s brought new synthetic yarns that were easier to care for than wool, didn't need careful hand washing, and came in bright new colors. Acrylic and nylon yarns democratized knitting further, making it affordable for everyone. The 1950s aesthetic of domestic perfection included skill in various crafts, and knitting was among them. Women knitted sweaters for their families, made matching mother-daughter outfits, created elaborate afghans for their homes. Pattern books from this era show countless cardigan patterns, baby layettes, and home decor items. The ideal 1950s homemaker was supposed to be skilled with her hands, creating beautiful things for her home and family. The 1960s brought a youth culture that initially seemed to reject traditional crafts like knitting. But by the late 1960s and into the 1970s, the counterculture embraced handcrafts as part of rejecting mass production and connecting to more authentic, simple ways of living. Young people who might have scorned their grandmother's knitting as old-fashioned now took it up enthusiastically, though with their own aesthetic. Knitting in the 1970s meant bold colors, chunky yarns, and quick projects. Fashion embraced knitted vests, ponchos, and shawls as part of the bohemian look. Pattern books featured models in knitted garments, posed in fields of flowers or rustic settings, emphasizing the natural, handmade quality. This era also saw men increasingly comfortable knitting publicly. Though knitting had never been exclusively female, it was now less stigmatized. The 1970s knitter valued the handmade, the unique, the personal. During the 1970s, Elizabeth Zimmerman became a transformative figure in knitting. Through her books, television show, and newsletter, she taught thousands to knit with confidence and creativity. Zimmerman encouraged knitters to understand the structure of knitting rather than blindly following patterns, to experiment, and to trust their own judgment. Her book, Knitting Without Tears, demystified knitting and empowered knitters to modify patterns, fix mistakes, and create their own designs. Her approach was revolutionary. Rather than presenting knitting as a set of rigid rules to follow, she taught principles and encouraged innovation. Zimmerman also popularized several techniques, including the seamless sweater knitted in the round, percentage-based sweater construction that could be easily adjusted for any size, and her famous EPS, the Elizabeth Percentage System, for sweater design. Her influence on modern knitting is incalculable, with her approach forming the foundation for much contemporary knitting instruction. The 1980s saw knitting's popularity fluctuate. As women entered the workforce in greater numbers, time for crafts decreased, and interest in traditional domestic crafts like knitting declined in some segments of society. Fashion moved away from hand-knit looks, and for some years, knitting was perceived as old-fashioned. However, dedicated knitters continued, and the craft never disappeared. Moreover, the 1980s saw the beginning of designer hand knitting, with knitwear designers like Cafe Facet creating elaborate, artistic knitted garments that were exhibited in galleries. Facet's bold use of color and complex Fair Isle patterns elevated knitting to art, showing that it could be as visually spectacular and technically accomplished as any art form. His work inspired countless knitters to see their craft as artistic expression rather than just practical activity. The 1990s brought gradual revival of interest in knitting, particularly among younger people seeking creative outlets and connections to traditional skills. The stitch and bitch movement began, with young knitters meeting in cafes and bars to knit together, consciously reclaiming the craft from its outdated image. These new knitting circles were often deliberately countercultural, taking a traditionally feminine, domestic craft and practicing it in public, social spaces while discussing topics far beyond the traditionally domestic. The Internet's growth in the late 1990s began transforming knitting, as it did so many things. Early knitting websites and online forums allowed knitters worldwide to connect, share patterns, and learn from each other without geographic limitations. Online communities formed where knitters could ask questions, show their work, and find support and encouragement. The Internet democratized knitting knowledge, making complex techniques accessible to anyone with Internet access. Suddenly, a knitter in rural Kansas could learn Estonian lace techniques from someone in Tallinn, or get help with Aran cables from an expert in Ireland. The early 2000s saw a full-blown knitting renaissance, often called the New Knitting Movement. Young people, particularly young women, embraced knitting enthusiastically, and it became unexpectedly cool. Celebrities were photographed knitting. Fashion magazines featured hand knits, and knitting books became bestsellers. Debbie Stoller's Stitch and Bitch series captured this movement perfectly, presenting knitting as hip, fun, and feminist, rather than old-fashioned or domestic in limiting ways. This revival rejected the idea that traditional women's crafts were inherently oppressive, instead celebrating them as valuable skills and creative outlets. The revival was partly reaction to digital saturation. In an increasingly virtual world, knitting offered tangible creation, something real and useful made with your own hands. The rise of Ravelry in 2007 revolutionized the knitting world. This free online platform created a social network specifically for knitters and other fiber crafters, where users could organize their yarn stash, cue patterns they wanted to make, record their finished projects, and connect with other knitters. Ravelry's pattern database became an incredible resource, with thousands of designers uploading patterns both free and paid. The site's project pages allowed knitters to see how a pattern looked in different yarns and sizes, read reviews and notes, and learn from others' experiences. Ravelry built a global knitting community like nothing that had existed before, with millions of members connecting daily. Modern knitting exists in fascinating diversity. Some knitters focus on traditional techniques and historical patterns, valuing connection to the past and preservation of cultural heritage. They knit authentic Fair Isle, traditional Shetland lace, or historical reproduction garments. Others push boundaries, using knitting in avant-garde fashion design, creating sculptural art pieces, or developing entirely new techniques. Most knitters fall somewhere between, appreciating tradition while embracing innovation. Contemporary knitting includes technical innovations that would astonish earlier knitters. Interchangeable needle sets allow knitters to create custom-sized circular needles for any project. Digital row counters, stitch markers in countless varieties, ergonomic needles designed to reduce hand strain, specialty tools for specific techniques. The modern knitter has access to equipment earlier knitters never dreamed of. Yarns have exploded in variety, from traditional wool in every breed and preparation imaginable, to cottons, silks, bamboo, soy, corn fiber, and countless blends. Hand-dyed indie yarns became popular, with small businesses dyeing yarn in small batches with unique colorways, creating yarns that are themselves works of art. The modern indie yarn scene connects dyers and knitters through online sales and fiber festivals, creating community around special, artisan-produced materials. Modern knitting patterns are available in astonishing variety online, from free patterns on blogs to professionally published designs on Ravelry, and through independent designers' websites. Designers can now reach customers directly without going through publishers, allowing more diverse voices and styles to flourish. Patterns are available for everything imaginable, from simple hats to complex lace shawls, from baby booties to intricate Fair Isle yokes, from practical sweaters to whimsical stuffed animals. Video tutorials on YouTube and other platforms allow beginners to learn techniques at their own pace, pausing and rewinding as needed. This democratization of learning means anyone with internet access can teach themselves to knit, learning everything from basic casting on to the most advanced techniques. The social aspects of knitting have flourished online and in person. Knitting groups meet in libraries, yarn shops, and cafes worldwide, promoting community and friendship alongside the practical craft. Online knit-alongs bring knitters together to work on the same pattern simultaneously, sharing progress and supporting each other. Charity knitting projects allow knitters to use their skills for good, creating hats for premature babies, blankets for homeless shelters, or comfort shawls for cancer patients. The therapeutic benefits of knitting have gained recognition, with research showing that the repetitive motion and focused attention of knitting can reduce stress, lower blood pressure, and ease symptoms of anxiety and depression. The rhythmic nature of knitting induces a relaxed, meditative state similar to meditation. Some therapists recommend knitting to patients, and knitting groups form specifically for therapeutic purposes, bringing together people dealing with illness, grief, or other challenges who find comfort in creating together. The mathematics of knitting has gained attention, with mathematicians and knitters collaborating to create knitted models of complex mathematical concepts. Hyperbolic planes, Klein bottles, Mobius strips, and other concepts difficult to visualize can be represented through knitting, making them tactile and comprehensible. This intersection of math and craft has brought knitting into academic spaces and demonstrated its intellectual dimension. Modern knitting is more inclusive than historically. While still predominantly practiced by women, men are increasingly visible in the knitting community, designing patterns, teaching, and sharing their work without stigma. People of all ages, from children to elderly, all backgrounds and identities find welcome in knitting communities. Adaptive techniques and tools make knitting accessible to people with various disabilities, ensuring everyone who wants to knit can participate. The slow fashion movement has renewed appreciation for hand knitting as people become more conscious of clothing's environmental and social costs. A hand-knit sweater takes time and skill, but lasts for decades, can be repaired easily, and eventually biodegrades, unlike synthetic fast fashion. Hand knitters know exactly what went into their garments, the fiber source, the dyes used, the labor involved, creating a connection to clothing that mass-produced fashion can't match. The pandemic of 2020 brought another surge in knitting's popularity. With people confined at home and seeking calming, productive activities, many turned to knitting. Yarn companies reported dramatic sales increases as both long-time knitters and complete beginners picked up needles. Social media filled with pandemic knitting projects and virtual knitting groups flourished as people sought connection during isolation. Today, knitting thrives in the paradox of being both ancient and contemporary, both traditional and innovative, both practical and artistic. A teenager might knit a sweater using the same basic stockinette stitch that a medieval knitter used, but from indie-dyed yarn in colors that didn't exist a decade ago, following a pattern downloaded from a designer in another country, while video chatting with knitting friends across the globe. The fundamental act, creating fabric from yarn using two-pointed sticks, remains unchanged for over 1,000 years, yet the context, materials, and community constantly evolve. Rest now and let your mind follow the path of yarn through needles, loop connecting to loop, row building on row, creating something warm and beautiful through patience and skill. The story of knitting is the story of human ingenuity and persistence, of communities forming around shared craft, of practical necessity becoming creative expression, of traditions carried forward while adapting to each new generation. Sleep peacefully, knowing that around the world, needles are still clicking, yarn is still flowing, and the ancient art of knitting continues, stitch by stitch, just as it has for over a millennium.